Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today to talk about competition in broadband space. I'm Kelcee Griffis with Bloomberg News, and I've got a fantastic panel with me today. Competition in the broadband marketplace is increasingly intense. Fiber, cable, fixed wireless, all of these technology delivery methods are vying for customers alongside traditional mobile broadband carriers and newer satellite-based offerings. Are we entering the golden age of broadband? We're here today to talk about that. Consumers have an array of choices like never before, and the federal government has committed to spending historic amounts of money on infrastructure investment. We're also going to talk today about what's working and what needs to change there. So I'd like to start by giving my panel the chance to introduce themselves. You can just say a few words about who you are, where you live the space from, and then I'd love to just kind of start our conversation by asking you to share what you think is the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity for broadband of note. Start by Angie.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Angie Kronenberg. I am currently president and CEO of Sligo Solutions LLC, which is my own firm that I formed at the end of last year. I've been a 30-year tech and telecom expert. I have worked in my own practice. I have managed a trade association in the kind of telecom space. And I also was at the FCC when we formed and implemented National Broadband Plan. What I still see as the most significant impact is the financing that Congress has provided to ensure that every American can have network access to broadband service. And I do think there's still a significant amount of work that needs to happen in that area. I really look forward to talking about that a little bit more in detail. But I also think it is key to look at the information that we have available to us today about the number of choices that consumers have for their broadband service. Yes, they need access, but they also need choice. And I also look forward to discussing the challenges of how we ensure that every consumer obtains more than just one or two options for their broadband service.
Good morning, Mike O'Reilly. I run my own consulting firm after about 30 years in the government, different roles. Happy to talk to this issue. It's really important. In terms of competition, I think it's we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the unserved population, and in there, the competition is between everyone to try and see if they can receive the grants that the government is putting forward to build in those areas, because those areas are not going to get competition. At best, you're going to have one provider. Maybe in some instances you'll have two, but these are the hard served areas, and we're not going to have multiple providers in most of those. We're talking the last 2 to 5% of America, the toughest geography, topography that's out there. So that area is not going to see competition except for who gets the money to build in those areas. And that we're going to see a lot of things as we get into the grant process. But in the other areas, there are going to be things on deployment that we could do in other parts, whether it be in metropolitan areas or tier 2 markets, suburbia. It is about competition in terms of how do we help deployment, whether it be permitting reform, which is absolutely necessary, and a part of that, I spend a lot of time talking about pole reform, pole attachment rates, and access. Things that if you really want competition to happen in some of those areas, you need to address the issues. So there are the two kind of universes I think we'll get into today.
Hi, it's Kronenberg's big win this week, so make sure I got that out there. The good guys won. We ended the empire.
Anyway, Leamer. I run also a consulting firm. There's a lot of consulting firms in tech and telecom, what we do. I work for Chairman of GPI and have kind of continued working in this space. Really thinking of things actually, I kind of come from how do you think about these policy conversations from a campaign manager perspective? How do you get things across the finish line and the issues before us? So that's kind of how I go into these conversations. And one of the areas that I think about a challenge going forward, and it's also an opportunity, is, I said this on the pre-call, but I think there's a lot of challenges when it comes to the future of the workforce in this space, and kind of coming into both conversations about what the commissioner said, and Angie made a comment about is when you think about the competition conversation, I am not just thinking about the largest companies at the top of the stack, but I'm also kind of wondering how it plays out for those who are building the infrastructure, who are laying the groundwork, like laying fiber, building the tower infrastructure and whatnot, and honestly the downstream effects that they have, and kind of how this all plays out. So whether it's thinking about the job opportunities that can come out of this, but also thinking about the future, especially with automation, especially with these other challenges before us, how it affects the hyper local level who are could be part of our closing the data divide and building out next generation connectivity. So yeah, that's kind of the big thing that I'm going to focus on and kind of hope to continue to explore this conversation.
Good morning, everyone. Not consultant council, although our hiring consultants, experts in this summit. But I think happy with the way I draw the access initiative, future for us. For those of you who come up here or they may know it's only us of IDR, we're a nonprofit. We're a nonprofit nonpartisan research organization. We work with policymakers and our global government to solve some of the hard policy challenges facing this country today. And I think both one of the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities to pattern those around the need in the digital network. Both the uncertainty of what we're thinking of preparing for Congress, but also knowing that for the first time that parity to access been not standard of every household and access to broadband and minimal speed. That's within our grasp. And we need to stay focused on achieving that goal. But I think that the best hope is challenging still looking forward to this session.
Fantastic. Well, as we already touched on a little bit, consumers have more ways to get broadband than ever before. We've actually seen a great example of this during the Super Bowl with T-Mobile and Starlink announced that they're rolling out satellite supporting texting to everybody. What do you make of this kind of convergence? So we're seeing mobile companies getting installed on broadband today. We're seeing cable companies starting to stand up their own MVNOs to offer mobile service. Is this type of convergence a good thing for competition? And is there a ceiling to its growth?
I think it's really great to see the new opportunities and how companies are kind of getting into the market. But I also think it's important to level set with where we are today and what we know. So just at the end, Chairwoman Rosal sort of administration, the FCC put out its communications marketplace report. And I really want folks to focus on what we know right now for the availability of competitive options for consumers in their homes. So today, we have 122 million households who are taking a home-based broadband service, what they call a fixed service. Of those, we have 112 million who have opted to pick the wired option, whether that's a cable, a fiber, or a telco-based copper option. Then we have 10 million households who've chosen a fixed wireless option, or they've chosen satellite. What we've seen from a competitive perspective is that it's expensive to build a new network, right? You have to actually get access to the customer. A third of the U.S.'s residents live in apartments and condos. So oftentimes, a competitive provider has to then negotiate to get access to the customers in those buildings. And oftentimes, incumbents have walked in those customers through either exclusive marketing arrangements or MPORielly type of arrangements. So that already takes off about a third of consumers who have the opportunity to get access from a competitive provider. And in addition, my reference says, right, part of the building process is you also get access to things like poles, sometimes wireless towers, right, which also makes it really difficult to build a network that is ubiquitous, that can reach everyone. So it's really important to understand we have these great new options that are coming into the market, but they oftentimes face some of these significant barriers to reach customers so that customers truly have the option to take those other new services that are coming into the marketplace. So I'll leave it there and see what my other analysts had to say.
I would say generally it's a good thing to have different options. And there are minimum structures. You don't want fly-by-night organizations, and the companies you mentioned are not of that. So it's generally a good thing. I lived through the 90s when it was telephone and local markets and long-distance markets, and Ed Markey did the speech a little bit ago talking about some of that. And now we're back at it. And there's going to be that tussle between the different markets and everyone entering each other's field. And we'll just see what dust lies after that goes on. And I don't know I like all of the broadband providers. I don't think there necessarily has to be, you have to favor one or the other. I love what fiber is able to do. I love what the cable provider is able to do. I love fixed wires, and I certainly love what the satellite guys are able to bring. So I don't think you have to be in someone's camp in this universe. But trying to figure out how do households have options and have service when it's needed going forward. So I think it's a really exciting time to be in this space.
Yeah, I would say my perspective on this might come from my time in the chairman's office, and it was really so fun whenever the chairman probably had a habit of putting out a lot of large agendas. Kelcee knows because she had to sit and listen to us talk every time. But like there were several agendas and several items on every agenda, and a huge part of it was making sure that we're addressing all parts of all the options. And you know, if you did something that one industry cared about, you almost had to do something to make sure the other industry knew that you cared about them too. As a parent of 3, I can tell you that parity is very important in parenting. In some ways, you have to think about policy making from that side too. And if you, they're all the same. Industry and children are basically the same. It's amazing. But I think that has to be an approach from policymakers' perspective, that all the above approach, and recognizing that if you're perceived, pushing one item over another or one into the other, it creates problems. It creates problems down the stack. It creates problems for a lot of policymakers, for civil society and others. And so, I think it's really important in this discussion for people on Capitol Hill, for people at the White House, for people at the FCC to be kind of coming from a balanced approach and recognizing that press releases matter, like statements matter, earnings calls matter, like recognizing that if you're not taking that balanced approach, if you're not enabling all ships to rise, and you're perceived, even if it's not intentional, as benefiting one or the other, it really creates friction down the road. And so I think, like, when I come looking at these conversations, or when I hear whether it's my former boss or the recent chairwoman or the new chairman, like, how are you coming across to make sure that you're enabling policies that allow all above? What's the conversation like in the congressional hearings? How are members answering questions? Are they perceived as pushing one agenda or the other, or are we creating an environment where these conversations are getting to the marketplace and we're not hindering their ability to come to the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, spoken like a true campaign manager. But I think the convergence is good. The more competition, more entrants in the marketplace is good. But I think we need to be clear about a few things. First, when we're talking about cellular and home connections, we're in mobile, wireless, whatever, all of them, some of these things are complementary. And I think that a lot of people talk about them as one can replace the other. But the research has been very clear that most consumers use their connections in complementary ways and want to have both options available. Second, I think it's important to, having creating an even playing field for all types of providers to enter the marketplace and, be competitive. But that does not necessarily mean that all technologies perform equally, that they all have the same reliability. And when we're thinking in particular about taxpayer dollars, that's something we, I think, can and should do a better job of distinguishing. And that is, in many ways, emblematic that we can have that conversation now is emblematic of all the progress that has been made both within technological innovations and the policy standards that have been passed. So, yeah, I think that's it from my standpoint.
Yeah. So I did just want to go back to something we were saying, and then I want to let you respond because we want to keep this conversational. First of all, Nathan, I do remember covering the pie agenda well. We were always getting out well past lunchtime. And I think you also made a great point that it's important to look at both how policymakers are talking about these technologies and also how the market is talking about these technologies and how like regular people are engaging with them and, what they're finding useful. So, yeah, please go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, now I wanted to address something that Kathryn was talking about, and that is how consumers engage with the technologies. She was discussing how consumers still are heavily reliant on having a home broadband service that is reliable, that is scalable, right? And we've seen that over time because so many consumers are connecting 20 devices at home and they have multiple users at home. And then yet we still have over 400 million different connections that are mobile, which also indicates, right? You have 122 million households with a fixed connection, and we have over 400 million individual subscribers for the mobile. It indicates that these are very dynamic markets, and it is really important as policymakers to consider how consumers are interacting and what changes are they seeing. So one of the things that I have advocated for at the FCC is that they collect a lot of information from companies, which is fantastic, and from public interest groups, which is also really great, but actually engaging with consumers directly and doing more survey work about what consumers are doing with these new technologies. Do they actually have the choice that I think sometimes the markets like to think that they do? And I think having more of a direct line with consumers and understanding how consumers view their choices and view competition in the various product markets is a really key and important thing for the agencies to be doing.
Definitely. Well, we're going to get into price in a few minutes, but I want to go ahead and address the elephant in the room here. Let's talk about the BEAD program. Congress, as you all know, committed $42 billion to connecting all of the unserved Americans with high-speed internet. But many in the new administration would like to see the program significantly reshaped in some way. I'd love to start with Kathryn, actually. Can you tell us what this reshaping might look like and how drastically the program can be reshaped before it starts conflicting with that underlying statute?
I'm not going to speculate on what will happen, but there are a few things that I think folks should know. First, what has been lost in a lot of the public narrative and the coverage of BEAD and DEA too, but is all the work that states have done in partnership with ISPs to reach this moment. First, we have states that are actively running grant rounds right now. They are taking bids from ISPs. They are evaluating how they get to that 100% served, underserved goal. But in order to solicit those grants, they've had to go through years of data collection and cleaning, intensive community and ISP engagement, business planning, what I will call not a light deduplication process to ensure that there is no deduplication of federal funds. There is a significant amount of due diligence that has gotten states exactly to this moment. So for the first time, we can actually feel confident that we can reach that goal again of 100% served. Looking ahead, though, I think it's very important for us to think about how we build on that progress and look at opportunities to alleviate some of the barriers to getting shovels in the ground. Should we be looking at things like removing requirements on letters of credit, on looking at past work that has been done on the ARPA broadband programs around things like NEPA, where ISPs are already completing some of these processes so they're familiar with it, they're replicable, and there's something that they can implement quickly. So I think that just knowing and acknowledging all the work that has been done to this moment and that bipartisan, bicameral members are eager to get shovels in the ground, and so is the administration. So how do we really focus on getting those shovels in the ground and quickly?
First, I would say that personnel is policy, and I'm super excited about President Trump's pick to run NTIA. I think Errol Roth is just an excellent example of someone who understands the policy, understands it from Capitol Hill, working at the SEC, working in the administration. She's just been a really excellent partner in a lot of policy conversations. And she's also about being efficiency and finding the right way of doing forward. The other person that matters a lot of this is now the Senate Majority Leader, in John Thune, who spent a long time talking about wasteful spending and broadband. And now we have a Doge. And now we have people who actually want to look at the most efficient ways to make sure we're allocating resources. I think I participated in Senator Thune's. He requested for comments on wasteful spending, and you get into a lot of duplicative programs, a lot of, I think 15 different agencies, 120 programs. Like, this is a lot. And trying to make sure we're right sizing it to make sure that we're not overbuilding, and making sure that we're getting the dollars to the people, to the spaces that need it, is going to be really important. And leveraging all of the above technologies we just mentioned, making sure that alternative technologies have a spot at the table. But also, and this is important to hear, alternative technologies should not be just one company. When a lot of people think of alternative technologies, they think of Starlink, and God bless them, but like, it can't be the Kleenex to tissue paper. We need more competition in that space. And I'm really excited to see some of the LEO companies, Kuiper and others, who are coming to table and actually deploying. I think that speaks to the whole larger approach, that allowing us to right size the technology accordingly. And then as a part of that dialogue, like I read Ted Hearn's newsletter every day. Everyone should be reading Policy Band. It gets the best newsletter, and whatever Kelcee writes too is also very, very good. But like, Ted's newsletter is great, and what's been fun over the past couple of days is he's literally writing posts of like different state-based people complaining about how these different technologies would be a problem for them in their state, in, like, for example, Alaska. And I'm like, oh, I wonder where that came from. And it's just kind of like interesting to see. I'm glad that he's reporting it, because it's showing that every state's different. Every state has different interests, and every state has to be, Louisiana and Delaware are very different than Alaska, and kind of recognizing that and kind of where they're coming at these conversations. So I'm kind of curious to kind of see how that plays out, because that's a trick also for thinking about BEAD is, on paper, you might want to say, let's reform, let's think of all these options, be efficient with the money, but also you run into the reality of different people who aren't always on the same page with that.
Well, then Kathryn's point is well taken, that states are finally reached a moment, but it took forever to get here. And in the meantime, the last administration adopted policies that this administration, I believe, is going to put in the garbage. Most of BEAD, all the extra policy add-ons, union pieces, a bunch of they're going into the garbage, is my opinion. And then the question is, what do you do with fiber preference? And there's going to be a hard push from some to dump that too. I don't know how that turns out, and there's definitely fans of dumping it, and will have a large voice in this administration. So I think BEAD is going to go through a significant review. It's not something, they can be ready to submit the material and take all the bids they want and then send them to MTA. I don't think MTA is going to process anything in the near term. I think they're going to figure out where they want to go beforehand, and the states better be ready to change and move off some of the positions they've been in. So I think we're going to see a significant rewrite of BEAD in some form or fashion. I just don't know what happens with the fiber preference. I think it violates the statute. But then the question is, and I've written about this recently, do you want to spend some time in court on that? If you look at what's happening in DC these days, I think the administration's saying, hey, well, we're going to play this out. We're not for the timid and the weak. We're going to do what we think is right. And so I think all of these things are going to be examined, and BEAD's going to look a little different than what people thought it would. Blame the Biden administration if you want. You can't spend 4 years building a program that goes nowhere. And that's where we are. Sure.
I think it's important, though. I agree with you. We would have liked to have seen shovels in the ground.
I'd like to. Come on. These are people who haven't had service ever in their life.
Commissioner, what I am saying is that there's a reason why Congress put all of these requirements in statute. And that has been documented by Senator Cruz, the GAO, in several reports, as well as other members of Congress. And that's because there are significant flaws with federal broadband policy, not just the structure of funding, not just the definition of broadband, but how we approach things like permitting, like workforce. I'm not saying that every step that the Biden administration took was correct or should be continued moving forward, but it has taken this long to get to this moment because Congress asked states and NTIA and other federal partners to use this time to clarify and, quite frankly, fix some pretty significant flaws that have stood in the way of deployment and effective use of funds for the last several years.
I'd love them to do certain things. They haven't done much on pole attachments. I'd love for them to revisit some of those things. So,
States have.
not many, not enough.
You want me to, Angie? You got anything to say? I'll try to play cleanup just a little bit. Sure.
No, this is fun. Let's lean into it.
So I think it's important to take a step back and look at where we've been and where we're going. And this is part of the issue with when you invite someone on the panel who's been around for 30 years. So back during the National Broadband Plan, the woman who wrote the chapter on universal service is actually sitting in the audience, and that's Carol Maddie. One of the things that she noted was, hello, Congress, if you really want us to connect everyone to broadband, the USF cannot do it by itself. We actually need you to give us a significant grant in order for us to connect everyone. And it took COVID, a 100-year pandemic, to really wake up Congress for them to realize, oh, you know what? You're right about this. We do need to make this significant investment. And it was bipartisan legislation. And during that process, what we learned is that there had been kind of a loss of trust in the FCC, and they really wanted the states to be involved in solving this problem. And that's really what Kathryn is referring to. So it's a much more complex situation now because you have every state, from the governor's office to the broadband office to the legislature, right, that have something at stake now. And so I do think there's so much complexity about how we'll see how the politics play out and what may change of some of the requirements. But I think it is really key to keep our eye on the prize. And that is when Congress was negotiating the BEAD project, the program, they knew that the United States was behind, drastically behind. When you look at what other countries are doing and the investments that they're making in fiber technology that feeds every other technology, from wireless to satellite, we knew that we needed to encourage as much fiber out there as possible. At the same time, though, the Congress knew they weren't going to be able to get fiber to every single home. That would just be way too expensive. So they did leave the flexibility that's needed to still connect everyone. We still need that balance. We need the balance of recognizing the need for efficiencies, but we also need to recognize where we are as a nation and that we cannot be behind the rest of the world. We do need to get the connectivity out there as quickly as possible, and it needs to be scalable technology. This is a one-time investment. We are never going to get this kind of money out of Congress again. So let's be smart about it, and then let's get it done. And I'm a firm believer in doing pole attachment reform. That could be a whole nother panel, but none of you would show up to talk about it. If we need to look at pole attachments, permitting, building access, like how do we ensure that these new technologies, that these new services that are coming in because they're supported by government subsidies can get into the hands of consumers as quickly as possible?
Well, I don't want to spend too much longer on this topic because obviously BEAD is just one corner of this universe of broadband funding and competition. But I do want to spend a couple more minutes on this because, like you're saying, like a lot of things have changed in the last couple of years as BEAD has gotten stood up. And I think one of those things is satellite. So I do want to just see if anyone wants to weigh in on whether satellite has gotten more reliable in the years since BEAD was first stood up. Are we looking at a different competitive landscape now than we were 2 or 3 years ago? And does that mean that satellite should be able to play a bigger role?
I'll get to the satellite in a second, but I would say, like, you know, just because there's a large pile of money being deployed or offered by Congress doesn't mean you have to accept all the bad policies that are come with it. Like, and I think a good point that the commissioner is raising is that, like, yeah, there's a lot of resources because of Congress made it available, but it has to be implemented in a way that doesn't create barnacles that then keep us from doing it the right way down the road. Like, you know, you can't give an alcoholic a drink because then they keep on drinking and then there's a problem. I think in the same way with states in the way that they're implementing, and these state broadband offices are implementing, they have to make there have to be better policies down the road that allow us to make sure that we're not enabling, you know, bad deployment practices. And I think that's an ongoing conversation. It's not just to be, but it goes across the board. And I think that's why it's good to debate it and discuss it. On satellite, like it is a very exciting technology. Every time I go camping now with family up in northern Michigan, you'll see at the RV parks like dozens of these little things popping out, and people are like, "Oh, this is cool. Now you go camping long term. This is great." But like, it has to be more than just going camping. And I think that's like what's exciting about these two new technologies, whether it's satellite, whether it's the next generation Wi-Fi, whether it's, you know, the new deployments in the wireless space. Like, there's a lot of opportunity across the board that is making technology better and more accessible. What I think is very important is, how is this allowing communities to participate in the next generation AI and the workforce and whatnot. And so, you know, I think it is very clear that we were seeing some major changes even from whenever Mike and I were at the commission to now. It's really exciting. But, you know, again, it kind of goes back to this kind of all of the above approach. Like, are we creating an environment that's allowing, you know, one to go over the other, but allowing all shifts to rise? That's
Anybody else want to address that? Otherwise, we'll move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the satellite's always been part of the picture. It will always need to be part of the picture. I think that there's some there should be some discussion about the way that the preferencing was treated. But I mean, what we've heard consistently from governors, state legislators, in addition to the offices, is that they want that investment in fiber in particular because of all of the stuff that actually everybody's talked about. We're talking about AI, national security, you know, just building out a more resilient infrastructure, and also one that can support the deployment of alternative technologies. They're eager for that, but they also know that right now they don't have the fiber in place to facilitate that. I've got a lot of feelings on middle mile too, but that's not what this is for. So I think, though, it's important to note as well, and where states have also highlighted where they want to be able to use LEO. I think that they might enjoy some flexibility in being able to just say, hey, there are certain locations where we should just say, this is where LEO should be connected. But there have also been several states that have launched pilot programs for satellite. That's Maine, that's Texas, South Carolina. Virginia is building on some lessons from pilot programs on mesh technology and just general wireless in densely populated areas that they did with ARPA funds. So there is a lot of that, innovation happening. And the more, as we see more information from these state plans coming forward, I mean, they're all technically out there, but they're just not finally approved. We are going to learn more about how states have approached this, and also the cost differential between these different types of technologies by location.
So that actually leads me perfectly into my next question, which is around broadband price. And I think BEAD is a great example of this, to talk about this broader theme. BEAD actually says that every state needs to have a low-cost broadband option, but now some of the states are moving to, change those requirements or challenging a $15 maximum price. What role does price play in consumer accessibility, and how do we need to maybe change our thinking about that being a barrier in 2025?
I mean, price is still the leading barrier to adoption, and that's not just the cost of a subscription, it's also the devices that come along with it. ACP going away is one of the biggest risks that states are still figuring out what to do. ISPs are still figuring out what to do. But ACP going away is put a huge question mark on top of speed and, quite frankly, the viability of these networks in the long term. We need internet service providers at the table. We also need to recognize that these are high cost locations. So we are looking at the capital costs. We need to be thinking about those operational costs. But actually, Commissioner, you said some stuff at a Pew event about a year ago on some of this, and particularly ACP as it relates to deployment, and how we need to be thinking differently about the business case moving forward. So I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I have supported ACP because it's about finding price support for those families that actually need it. I think it was too generous, and there were forms that people weren't willing to make, and the program expired because of some of those things. So there were problems in the policymaking side, but I think the premise of addressing affordability is proper, because you're only trying to subsidize those families that actually need it. In terms of price overall, I'm opposed to, and have written about this extensively, we're going to object to price regulation. So I don't expect you're going to see that from this administration. I think you're going to see them doing just the opposite. So you're not going to see them regulating prices on the front. The question is, can we find some way to subsidize those families who absolutely need it when the economics turn against them? So I'm in favor of doing that, but it has to be a program that can be sustainable and one that can be garnered support from a lot of different individuals.
I just want to flag for the audience that, it's important to recognize where we are with respect to the jurisdiction over broadband. And because of the most recent Sixth Circuit decision that the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction as broadband as a Title II service, this thing gives room for states to potentially regulate in this area. And we've seen some states who've already implemented affordability requirements. And I think we likely could see other states do the same thing, which then will raise questions likely for the current FCC. I imagine that there will be ISPs who are going to be seeking preemption by the FCC, and we'll then see legal challenges to that. So this is a problem for consumers, but yet here in DC, there will be potentially action going on related to it. I would just urge people, let's listen to the people and what it is that they really need. And let's look more closely at what happened after the ACP. So I think there's room here potentially to find solutions, and certainly a federal solution would be preferred, because we do need to make sure consumers can get connected. Why would we spend all this money building networks if people can't afford it? So let's really tackle that issue and tackle it together in a way that is politically and legally sustainable.
Great. Well, I'd like to move on to talking a little bit more about Congress. A lot of this goes back to the statute. So, Mike, I'd like to start with you. What changes would you like to see Congress make to the 1996 Telecom Act to respond to some of these changing conditions? And relatedly, do you think there are changes the FCC should be making to respond to some of these conditions?
Well, look, and I think that there are definitely things I'd like to see the Congress address, but I don't actually think it's quite possible. We have really thin majorities in both the House and in the Senate, so I'm not optimistic they're going to legislate on dramatic changes to the '96 Act. I don't think you're going to see net neutrality statute be enacted anytime soon. I don't think you're going to see revision of ACP anytime soon. They're focused on other things right at the moment. I just don't see those being top of the priority. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be, but it's just not in the cards, in my opinion. There are definitely a laundry list of things I would do, and will recommend that the Congress tries to provide some relief. But massive reform here is probably unlikely. Things like preemption has to be in the cards, in my opinion. But I don't think that's going to be a trade-off for rate regulation. So there are things that you could do that would fit, but I just think it's a hard sell right at the moment.
I would agree with that. I do think that federal preemption has to be a part of the conversation. I also think the one thing I'm paying attention to most is the conversation around USF, future of USF, and the working group there. It's a very interesting space where you're having a bipartisan conversation with a lot of interesting ideas that are are at play. And I think that's actually where I would say a lot of opportunity could come from to kind of see some long-term changes. But the commissioner, I don't know that we're going to see. I think 1996 Act probably will survive its 30th brand anniversary and not see any changes before then.
But Nathan's right on USF. There is going to need to be some aspect of universal service, and I've been calling it a patch. And this is the immediate issue: what happens with the Supreme Court's review of this? And I've been working with some folks to try and figure out how do we address that. That sets aside all the bigger issues. How do you deal with distribution? How do you deal with contribution? And all the bigger issues that are out there. It sets those aside for another day, because that's not something you can resolve. As someone who's worked on USF probably just as long as Carol, and with different viewpoints necessarily, it's not something you can resolve in a 2-year window, in my opinion.
Mhm. Well, I want to go to you, Nathan, to talk about telecom workforce issues now. Broadband obviously doesn't install itself. It's very labor intensive, it's capital intensive, it requires lots of boots on the ground. So, what are some of the telecom workforce issues that are constraining the growth of the industry right now, and what can we do to address that?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is you need to start paying more attention to the people who are laying fiber and building towers. And there's 2 ways to do that. I want to give a shout out to the team at NCTA with their Every Last Mile documentary, which is a really neat way to see what it's really like on the ground, and in some cases below the ground. And then also there's my friends at Nate. Yes, it's hilarious, Nathan talking about Nate. I get it. But they put out a documentary a couple years ago called Vertical Freedom, which is about looking at the stories of those tower climbers who are building and deploying cell phone towers. I have gone up 300 feet, not bad. 1,200 feet less than Brendan Carr has done. He's done 1,500. Congratulations to him. He wins. But anyway, I spend a lot of time actually working with these men and women who are really actually have dirt under their nails and wear work boots and are actually doing what's needed to deploy. And there's a number of different things that need to be changed. First, I would say everything from the OSHA heat rule is a disaster for tower climbers, because basically the heat rule requires you to spend a certain amount of time in the shade. The problem is if you're up a tower, you then have to climb back down just to go back out, and then things like that. The other thing is even the way that we write rules, like the digital discrimination order had lines specifically covering entities, including tower climbers. I don't know how a tower climber or a fiber linesman actually is perpetuating disparate impact. I just don't understand how they're doing that. They're just building the tower. It's like holding the roofer accountable for people in the house. Those type of things, they have long-term effects. I didn't know until I started working with these guys that it takes 16 months to get a bucket truck to deploy. That's insane. That's because of some international trade stuff. Those are the type of things that hinder their ability to deploy. At the same time, there's actually some ways in which companies could, I think, go about things differently with these tower climbers and other contractors that I worked with and the linesmen. For example, some of these guys don't get paid for 6 months or a year afterwards. And it is really hard when you have a crew of 4 or 5 people or 7 people to be able to do that. Chairman Carr had a really good comment at a policy forum that we hosted last month, where he specifically said we need to do more to make sure that they're able to do their job and being paid, and actually that the wages make sense, because these wages haven't really changed in 5-10 years, and with all the inflation and everything else, they're still affected by it. There's also kind of interesting rules where basically you have to certain people abide by certain standards for safety and others are not. And that means the people who are not abiding by the safety are able to undercut prices. All these interesting dynamics, and taking time to actually focus on these hyper local issues are really actually going to be a long-term thing that I'm paying attention to. The tower climbers, I think, are 1,100 small businesses or 5 to 10 employees. The linesmen are, I think, 1,300, and they're smaller companies. These are small players at the end of the rope. But I think at the end of the table, I think it's really important for our conversations to be thinking about how they're deploying, what's inhibiting their ability to deploy. How does NEPA play into that? How does permitting reforms long term? What's going on in the city if they're making this determination that you can't deploy here in this way and these rules? It's one of the reasons preemption rules I'm interested in, because it hinders their ability to deploy. I'm just learning more and more about how a lot of the decisions we're making are applying to them in ways. And it's a dynamic that I think needs to be heard more. And I think in this age with President Trump and with a lot of conversations about those on the kind of Republican circles talk about that kind of blue collar worker that are usually not thought of in Republican conversations, I'm hopeful this creates an opportunity to kind of talk about those issues. And that's one of the reasons I want to kind of, raise it here. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to get in on the workforce conversation?
Yeah, just plus one to a lot of that. We're doing research right now on the telecommunications workforce and some of the effects that may or may not happen with BEAD. And there have been some interesting things very similar to what Nathan just lined out coming out of that research. I think on the competition point, we know that there is going to be interstate competition competing for the same workers across state lines. And then there are also industries that are competing for the same labor force. Energy is the one that most often comes up, particularly when we're talking about small providers. Both of those factors could have an increase. They influence competition, but they also influence the ultimate cost of deployment. I also wanted to share just some numbers with you. Continuum Capital released a report that there will be 28,000 new construction jobs required to build out these networks between 2025 and 2032, as well as 30,000 new technician jobs for that same time period. So again, that's 28,000 new construction jobs, 30,000 new technician jobs. We need to figure out a way to fill these roles, and they're careers. They're not just jobs. One thing that we haven't talked about in this conversation related to BEAD is the use of non-deployment funds. And many states are planning to use non-deployment dollars, if they have them, to help address some of these workforce shortages. So they're working with internet service providers, community colleges, workforce development boards to stand up apprenticeship programs, pipelining programs. Montana actually has one that's active now. So as we think about kind of what BEAD looks like moving forward and some of the interventions that are needed, workforce is certainly one of those things that we'd like to see some progress on.
One more plug. If you're interested in visiting some of those community colleges to learn about their program, you should talk to either of us, I'm sure. But also, if you want to dig, check it out yourself. Let me know. I'm happy to connect you with some people who can help you dig. And if you are crazy enough to go climb one, I'm happy to get you to climb.
People,
I've already put in my plug.
You're gonna help 60 people email.
Well, actually, to be fair, we hosted a tower climb for hill staffers earlier this year, and I was surprised I had 20 hill staffers who were excited to climb 75 feet in the air and learn about this. But my point is get out of here. Go out. I love to stay there. I'm not trying to leave the conference, but after the snowstorm and stuff, find ways to see what this infrastructure looks like, how they're being deployed, how it's connected to the community. And I think that's just whether it's digging or going above, there can be great job opportunities, and there should be good workforce programs. Also, we need to realize some of the downstream effects of decisions or lack of decisions that are here really hinder their ability, because there could be an opening shortage of jobs, but that could go away in 2 or 3 years if a funding program goes out.
Yep.
And that's the thing that needs to be more continuity for these companies. One of a friend of mine, he had to close his company up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, literally last week, because of kind of the inconsistency in the workforce. It's a hardship for the 4 or 5 guys in that team, and that's just happening everywhere if we're not being more consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think your point about this policy versus real world disconnect is well taken, because it's very easy to get in DC policy circles. We're talking about these ideas and not looking at how it, affects real people. So speaking of disconnects, Angie, I want to turn to you to talk about USF reform and what needs to happen there. What are we going to be seeing in the next year? And how can, especially the Congressional Working Group, maybe address some of these disconnects in the way that funding is collected and dispersed?
Yeah, thank you, Kelcee. I would just reiterate some of the points that Mike has already made. We have a Supreme Court decision that will happen before the end of this term that's going to be looking at essentially the constitutionality of the USF. So potentially you may need Congress to intervene to address any of the issues that could come out of that decision. So stay tuned for that. I agree that it's unlikely to see the working group produce anything publicly until that court decision occurs. And what we know about their work is that there was a lot of focus on it, looking at the low income issue, affordability of broadband, and also looking at contribution reform. I think that it's key for the working group to take a broader look at something that Nathan mentioned. We have a lot of funding that has been happening for broadband, a lot of different programs. So, where is there overlap? Where do we need streamlining? Where are programs that potentially it's time for them to wind down? And that potentially is funding that could be used for ensuring that low income families have affordable service, right, by subsidizing them directly. So I think that it's important for this working group to assess where we are right now. And that is, we know that there's a lot of focus by the new administration on efficiencies. And there are some things that they can do. I also think there are things that the agencies with jurisdiction over various programs can do to look for efficiencies as well. So, would encourage that look in addition. So, those are my thoughts, but welcome anybody else's perspective on USF.
My only take on USF, and I've been working on this for a long time, is that you can't just do one piece. You can't just do contribution reform. You've got to look at distribution. To Angie and to Nathan's point, there are a lot of programs out there that need to be reformed and combined. So distribution has to be part of it. And then administration, which maybe we deal with as part of the patch, but that doesn't solve the bigger issue on administration. So all those pieces have to come together, and that requires time and difficulty. And has been proven to be one of the hardest issues in communication policy to solve.
Yeah. Could I, controversial perspective, let the USF working group do whatever it's going to do, but we've all sat up here and talked about other ways to chip at fairly significant issues with federal broadband policy, permitting, pole attachments, labor. We haven't even talked about digital skills and how the absence of that, what that will do to our economy in the long term. There are other ways, and we need to remember that there are other ways that we can chip away at the challenges that we're facing right now without tackling the behemoth. Well, while others maybe tackle the behemoth that is USF.
Great. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. If we want to turn this to the audience, I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm sure we've got folks watching on the live stream too. Does anyone want to ask any questions to our panelists while we have them here? I see one right there.
Hey, I'm Nat Purser with Public Knowledge. I wanted to ask how changing the mix of technologies, so giving a little bit more to fixed wireless and LEOs under BEAD, if it gets reconfigured, how that could shape the broadband affordability conversation, because we know that Starlink is cheaper to deploy. That's great. It's still $100 to $120 a month for most consumers. That's like the average subscription price. So can you talk about how changing the configuration of technologies could enhance bipartisan support for a tech-neutral voucher like the ACP, or through a revised USF, just to create a stable base of demand where those new networks are being built?
I think you're looking at me. Sure.
Everybody.
Sure. I'll start and then people jump in. Okay, I don't know if they're going to change the current structure. I said that's the toughest nut to crack. I think there's the policy issues, and then you have what do you do with the BEAD demarcation line. I think it's going to change, but we'll just have to see what it does. I favor an ACP type structure because it's exactly what Angie mentioned before. I wrote an op-ed about this, that if we don't deal with affordability on the front end, we're going to deal with it on the back end. And so what I like about ACP is you target just those households, because right now under subsidy programs, we're subsidizing a lot of households that don't make any sense. And don't need the support, and that's problematic. So when you're talking about costs, though, you're asking the costs on satellite compared to others. There are long-term costs, and we make it seem like the one technology can be cheaper if we just throw these billions at it. But then if you talk to the companies, they'll say, "Oh, but we need operational support later on. You're gonna give us operational support later on, aren't you?" It's like, we weren't planning on it. Well, you're going to need to do that. That's got to be factored as part of the equation. So you can't just say one technology is more expensive if you're not doing a complete comparison.
I'm Drew Connor with the Benton Institute.
You had mentioned that a lot of these bead areas are only probably going to be accessible because of the government subsidy to build the networks. Without a low cost requirement and without competition, how do we ensure that people can actually afford to take advantage of these giant public investments? Again, I think you're looking at me, and I'll answer your question. Anyone? Oh, sure. Uh, to your point in terms of competition, I don't think we're going to have multiple. The grant programs haven't been set up to have multiple providers within a market. So there's going to be one winner, right? In most instances, and the question is, how do you make sure that the families within that area can afford it? I favored an ACP to try and do that. It doesn't exist, so I don't know how you exactly deal with that, and that's what we're going to fight over in the next couple months or a couple years. And as long as it takes for the bead dollars to go on, I don't know how long it's going to take for that to go up. But I think you're going to see reform to the last structure, and we're going to see what that means and let the dust settle. I don't know how you deal with the affordability issue without some type of ACP. But I also see a problem with states setting up their own ACP. So there are a lot of policy issues, and I know we're in DC. I've traveled to those states, and over my time, and I've been there and tried to figure. I've sat at kitchen tables when people are like, "I can't afford it. I've dumped this, but I can't afford." I get all of those things, and that's kind of what's made me land where I am. But they're not easy issues. They're not easy answers. Going forward, there is a mechanism to just say, okay, it's going to be very low cost. It's not in the cards. So you don't see a requirement, the low cost requirement in these monopolies. There is a low cost requirement in BEAD, so that's statutory. Well, I'm not saying we should steep, but that's this Congress to decide. I used to work there, and that was when I got to make some of the decisions. I don't. They put it in the statute that people can change it and they can reform it to how they see fit. The administration will have an opportunity to implement it. I don't believe in rate regulation as part of that, but it is in the words.
Hi. So I was wondering something that was being thrown around this conversation is some households don't, I guess not need, but that they shouldn't qualify for these low cost initiatives. So I kind of wanted to know, can you clarify on what a household that does not need these services would look like?
Look, I used to run some of these programs, so I'm happy to go through that. But the issue fundamentally is when someone says that ACP can cover 45% of America, that's too broad. That's not sustainable. We burn through the dollars too quickly. If you want to put a partisan hat on it, I think that when I talked to people on the Hill, they thought the number for Republicans was between 5 and 10%. That was the households that they were willing to support. 45% of America, not in the cards. And that's why you had such a disconnect. I went and tried to sell ACP. We did the meetings. It was not fun to try and convince Republicans when they say 45% of America is eligible. Not a chance I'm ever going to be for that. It's hard. So there were reforms that were put forward, lots of reforms that were, and I endorsed a lot of the reforms. Not everyone did. And I said, hey, if we don't, we're going to be in a problem.
Yeah, I jump on that too. Like, there were a lot of stories that were really easy to cherry pick and sort of say, look at this family. They're actually making way more above the poverty line, and they're here. So like those stories, especially in a Doge era that we're in, like it has to be above reproach. It has to be like we're targeting this to those who are actually really in need and making sure and I think that conversation coming out of COVID has also changed, where there's also this idea of like in 2020, 2021, I think the environment was a little different. And I think that thinking about that long term and realizing, okay, what is that? Maybe it's 15% of America, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 20, like, figuring out what that is. I'm sure we could actually have a larger debate about what that number should actually be. And maybe it's different in New York versus Louisiana. I don't know, probably. But like, that's also, I think, a part of that conversation. But, what became really hard was being able to talk about what reforms were acceptable, because a lot of times when we were looking for, I think the commissioner was really leading on this, is looking for pragmatic solutions. We would be pilloried on the other side of being like, you're just trying to hand out government money to everyone else. So it's like, really, we're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And like, it really was that kind of environment. And so I think that's important for people to really think of this pragmatically. But okay, what really can we do here, especially in like a Doge era that we live in?
There is a current standard that's being used for the Lifeline program, which is part of the Universal Service Fund. That's been a long-standing standard for affordability for low-income families. So you may want to look at that. I know that's something that's been of interest as part of the potential for bringing ACP into USF or through some kind of funding mechanism that I know the Hill staff has been also considering and what that means in terms of the number of families that would be qualifying under that standard. So I'd point you to that. The second thing that I think it's maybe useful to you in your understanding of this is to look at the FCC's most recent communications marketplace report. There, they were discussing what is considered affordable service and kind of looking at a broad view of the economy and how much money a family should be spending on broadband. And they had some information in there about what it looks like on a state or regional basis. Just they didn't make any determinations. It was more just trying to get the facts out. But I think that it would be useful for you to take a look at that as well.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time. I'm sure all of us would love to continue these conversations online. So please say hi and let's just keep talking about these things. Thank you for being here and thanks for your attention.